welcome. Thank you for being here. I'll just do a brief introduction. My name is Aidan Nelson. I'm one of the current researchers in residence at ITP, which is the Interactive Telecommunications Program. And among other things, I've been part of this archival project with a number of the other researchers to find out more about what is YORB. And YORB, as we understand it, is this interactive TV show from the 1990s. And with us today is one of the members of the original team of YORB, Mr. Eric Fixler. Thank you very much, Eric, for being here.
Very welcome. Very welcome.
So to start off, how did you first get involved with ITP with YORB?
I mean, the ITP story is a good one. It's probably a little bit out of scope for you guys, but I was actually teaching video making to high school students at the time, and I had kind of gotten interested in the Amiga computer and doing computer stuff. And but I was also thinking about going to law school, and I had actually applied to law school and gotten into law school. And then I read this article in the New York Times about Dan, actually, and about the show that he did before YORB, also on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and the name is escaping me right now. But I was like, I think I want to do that instead. So I actually went down to ITP. I met, I think Kate Swan, Dan's wife, might have been the first person I met. I met Red, just kind of wandered into the office like he used to be able to do before 9/11 and such. And I ended up going to ITP. So to the question of how I kind of fell in with Dan and with YORB, I think there's probably a couple angles to that. One was like I had already been doing video work and computer work before I was at ITP, so I was really interested in what Dan was doing. But the truth is, it was really Dan. I took my first semester, I took Dan's Intro to Computational Media class. I can still remember the first thing I coded was that Pong game. And then I guess Dan thought I wasn't a moron. And I guess my second semester is when I started. I might have done a little bit my first semester. I don't really remember, honestly, but I think the second semester was when that was, official. And we were on 3 nights a week at that time. So before me, I don't know if you guys talked to Naiwei Shu. Before me, there was a guy named Naiwei who was actually working on it as well. And then I came in. Me and Naiwei were in parallel for a while, but I think Naiwei kind of rolled off. But yeah, I think I stepped into the chaos at the beginning of my second semester at ITP, and then kind of ran with it for the rest of the time that Dan was working on it. And then at some point, Nick took it over. That was probably like already my last semester, and then my last semester I kind of rolled off.
Okay, so to answer your question, no, we haven't talked with Naiwei yet, but they're on our list. We've talked with Tom Igo, with Dano, and with Madeline Altman, as well as one of the current ITP full-time faculty who at the time of YORB was a teenager and only audience member that we've found so far.
Yeah, that's kind of the fun stuff. Yeah, so all the people that you mentioned, obviously other than Dan, they all worked on YORB like after me, like more in like the Nick West time. But it's funny, like one of the things I'll never forget about YORB. So we had our time slot had moved. We're on at 8 for a while, and then we moved to 11. At 8, our audience was all teens and preteens, or mostly all teens and preteens. And it kind of changed a little bit when we moved to 11, but we had kind of a pretty hardcore audience. And one day I was having brunch at Cafe Jaffa, and I don't even know what Dan's told you. In general, during my time at YORB, I was the host of the show, in as much as there was a host. And I was eating my Sunday brunch at Cafe Jaffa over on St. Mark's, and the person next to me is like, "Oh, you're Eric from YORB, aren't you?" And it's a really funny thing. It's a really funny thing because you have to realize, like, nobody saw my face.
Yeah.
Nobody knew, like, who the hell. Like, they only heard my voice, and we had different avatars in different periods. But let's say the most common way they would have seen me was, as a set of animated lips. So that was very funny, and I'm super glad that you found someone like that. I mean, I think if you kind of get if you kind of hit people from Manhattan, from the right age, from the right time, they like more than two of them will know what YORB was.
So what would you characterize as the right audience? What was the audience of YORB like? And did you have any other interactions with them?
I did. I think, what is it? Well, I mean, I'm having, okay, so, yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in all these. So you have to, there's not any one answer to that question, because to an extent, the answer was dependent on different phases of YORB. So initially, you could only have one person on at a time. And we always had these things where you could fax in images or use the BBS to send in images or stuff like that. And I think in that phase, the user was I don't know, was somebody who was really, who was kind of plugged in already in a way to how tech and weird that thing was, because I think it was a little bit hard to understand at that time. It was also probably we probably had a lot of technical glitches. Then when we had multiple people, when you could have 4 people on at a time, when we first added that was a whole new phase. And what we used to get then, when we were on at 8 o'clock, when we had the 4 lips, we would have middle school, high school kids. They would coordinate at school. They would all call in at the same time, and they would occupy all of our phone lines. And we would eventually have to kind of kick them off to keep things moving. But I mean, I think to those kids, it was a total trip. Now, the thing about uploading media to YORB, in a way, I think those people watch the show, and my memory might even be off. But I think that we did get people who faxed images and BBS images in, although I think a bunch of that was done by us or other ITP people. But we did also get things cold. In a way, those kind of weren't really the same people who would call into the show and watch it real time. When we got bumped to 11 o'clock, and I don't mean bumped like we didn't want it. I think the 3 nights a week was super hard to manage. I mean, I was just at ITP all the time. I mean, between coding YORB and hosting YORB, it was completely a full-time job. But it got really porny for a while. So it was when people discovered that they could upload porn images, and then they could hop on the phone line, if you guys know the core thing, it's you use your touch tone keypad as a joystick. One of the people who was on the phone line had control, their avatar would look a little bit different. So once they knew that they could fly to to one of the 3D models in the world and hit porn, that kind of changed things for a while. And we had, I'm totally not really answering your question, but I don't know, we just had all these kind of Manhattan idiosyncratic people. We had one guy who would call all the time, and he would be kind of quiet, and then he would kind of do his Howard Stern Bop Bop Booey impression. Oh, that was the worst. People who were really into Howard Stern at the time, that was a thing. But I would have to say and again, it's a long time ago, and and I don't always trust my memories, but the three trends that stand out was like teenagers, porn aficionados, and then just people who like. I think that being able to speak on TV, again, like let's take the uploading media out of the picture. I think being able to speak on TV, I mean, that was a pretty unique thing at the time. And there was like a cohort of people who just wanted to say something on the air, and who just wanted to chat. And I think that those people were kind of all over the place. And in a way, like part of my role was making conversation with them and moving the conversation and, kicking people off when we needed to. I mean, I don't even mean like because they were being quote unquote bad. I mean, just to kind of for time and to keep it moving.
Sure.
And then there was also a phase. So at one point, so then we had kind of had like two sort of quote unquote external connections that we added to YORB. So one was the camera pointed down out the window of the office. And do you guys know about this stuff or no? So
we've heard a little bit about this.
All right, great.
Please.
Okay. So, we basically had a camera like on a freaking 2x8 that I remember we had sandbags on it. I'm sure it was secured. I'm still amazed that nobody on the street died. But there was a plank, there was a camera on the end. Hanging down from the camera was a megaphone or a speaker. There was no microphone, if I recall correctly. So the thing was that the people who were called in could talk to the people on the street. And it kind of, and I think also that came up when we were on late night. Like that I don't think would have worked well at 8 o'clock. But we did have like people who knew Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to like be on the street. And we, again, like I have to kind of dig it up. So we totally, like there was a thing where people, so there was one of the icons in the show you could fly to, and then you would have the view down on the street, and then you could holler at the people on the street. That was really popular. That was super popular. So, so people would try to get people on the streets, look up or do things or blah, blah, blah. And again, like I can't really kind of pull that into a cohort, but I think the cohort, whatever it was, kind of changed when we added that. And then we had the connection with Echo, with East Coast Hangout. So that was, then we had so Echo was a text bulletin board, and we were basically, so Echo, and again, ask me questions about Echo if you don't know what it was or understand how it worked, blah, blah, blah. So what we had was like on maybe the bottom 15 or 20% of the screen, we had a live text roll from one of the channels inside Echo. So we had like all these people like Susan Campbell, Jamie Barnett, like there were all these people that I knew from Echo who also used to synchronize. So they would be watching TV and typing on Echo at the time. And that experience never got it was synchronized for some people. It was never, there was a cohort of people who would be watching and doing both at the same time. And there would be a cohort of people who weren't. So I think, so the Echo thing was a little different in that it wasn't conditional. Okay, the whole central conceit of YORB was that every 3D object was like a folder, essentially. And the Echo thing was one thing that was an exception. It was a live scroll all the time. But that kind of brought us in with, that brought us there were a bunch of people who came in from that, and probably those people were a little bit more kind of closely aligned, or more like the kind of population that went to ITP, right? Because a lot of people on ITP were on Echo, or knew people on Echo. It was kind of very much like
the
that
people
same
who were
world
already
of
on the
people
web
at the time.
and on social spaces on the web.
Yeah. I mean, Echo was basically like the digital social space in New York at that time among a certain substrate.
So you mentioned these 3D models in the ORB version of YORB, which is while you were a part of it. What were some of the most popular models to be visited at the time?
It's such a good question. And again, it's like, it's a memory thing. Like, I can remember the bike model because that was one that I was, I think, particularly attached to the content of, because I made the model and was interested in the content. We had like male and female characters. It's a good question. I would actually have to, I think, I look back at things. I don't, I don't, I don't totally remember. B, I would resist the temptation to go too far around the idea of narrative coherence,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, there was stuff, and we would change the models a lot, and to some degree, what we were doing with models was like very closely tied around how many polygons we could render per second
Yeah.
at the SGI machine we were using, which was up at the medical school. So there were models, they changed. I think the thing about the YORB, as you described it, I probably like kind of like to maybe pop it out like at a like more like system-wide level. Like, its central conceit was the simplicity. I mean, it was 1,000 polygons. It was very cartoonish, which in a way, which looks a lot like what you guys have now. And so I think if we're kind of looking at the difference between like those two iterations of YORB, like the first one was like unconstrained movement, right? Like the movement was free, and the vibe was cartoony. And then the YORB 2, or whatever you call that one, was kind of inverted. It was like the production values were much higher. There were many more pixels, but the lines that you could navigate on were predefined because it was essentially all like interstitial videos connecting everything. So whatever the actual like content was of the models in YORB, like that, the kind of and I'm sure one of them actually did represent there was like also like kind of like a bulletin board. There was one that was intended to be a neighborhood bulletin board. I remember that. But in general, I think the experience was kind of more around like it's very cartoony and you just kind of go and explore it. I don't think this is a bad thing, but I don't really think we ever got to a point where people really felt that like it was predictable what would be where, and that they kind of, except for the porn. Like the porn is the only exception.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think just before we go any further, I wanted to ask, we've been like trying to basically build a sense of the community around this project. We know Dano was the originator, and later it lived on with Nick West heading it up. We've heard the names Big Twin, Madeline Altman, Shannon McGarity, and Naiwei Shu associated with it.
And Shannon crosses over both. So I crossed over both a little bit, but Shannon crosses over both. Shannon started after me, but continued after me as well. So, if I remember correctly.
So when you were involved in it, what was the team, and also what was your sort of role within it?
I mean, I don't really think there were any roles at that time. I don't know. I did what Dan wanted me to do, or what I wanted to do, or whatever combination of both. Like kind of, like I said, like I think I don't want to speak for Dan here because but I would say like for the first like 6 to 9 months for sure, like that shit was a way of life. Like it really was. So I mean, I was learning at that time how to do things like hardware programming and how to deal with like the RSC32 serial boards and the phone interfaces. So I think kind of Dan was like, brought a lot of that stuff in. But certainly like Dan's idea, and Dan was driving it, but in the sense that like I was coding, our stack was like we had an Amiga. We had the Amiga ran like this authoring environment called CanDo. We had another Amiga running our like video switching. We had the actual bulletin board was a HyperCard stack. Then we had we had the phone control cards. we had all that shit wired up. So I think, I was doing a lot of coding in like all the places where we had coding. And then I was hosting the show. So, my role was Dan's graduate assistant. So I guess my role was to do what Dan told me to do. Niway started before me. I can't remember exactly when Niway rolled off. Like Niway did a lot of work on the 3D authoring side of it. And the 3D authoring tool that we were using, I don't remember what it was called, the one that controlled the SGI computer, that had been developed by like Jaron Lanier and David Levitt. David Levitt, who had been a visiting professor at ITP for a while. And I think, again, I could be wrong here, but I think that Niway was primarily focused on the 3D side of things. Whereas I just did whatever Dan told me, whatever had to be done. And then
Sure.
Shannon, I think Shannon kind of came in in the same way. Shannon eventually took over hosting. Again, I don't remember when that happened. I think that was already with the Nick and Big Twin version, but I don't remember exactly when that happened.
Eric, while we're waiting for Aidan to get back, I'm curious, what were you doing prior to applying to law school and, then ultimately landing at ITP, but what was your background in? I
spent my 4 years between college and ITP working in the film world in New York. The last thing I did before ITP, and it was actually my part-time job, my first semester until Dan rescued me, to be quite honest, saved me from having to effing work. I shouldn't say that because it was a cool job. I worked for the New York City Board of Education, and I was a roving video instructor. So I had an office at Washington Irving High School, not too far from where ITP is. And I would go to different schools, and I would camp out in the school for a few weeks, and I'd work with a group of kids and make mostly music videos. That was my last thing before ITP.
Cool. That's very cool. Sorry, Aidan. Welcome back.
No worries. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I guess I was just mentioning it's impressive the amount of different ways of interacting with YORB were possible. As you can see from me glitching out, it's still challenging to implement a lot of this stuff today. So I'm just wondering what were some of the technical hacks that made this possible?
It's funny because to pull back for a second, our modems, our early modems were 2400 baud, and we were so stoked when we got 9600 baud. And the model has just changed today. Everything, we're kind of using things that are living on Amazon's cloud or on Google's cloud, and you don't really have direct contact to it, and everything is virtualized and blah blah blah. So we were working with these high-level authoring environments mostly, but we were kind of working with stuff that was pretty lo-fi and was pretty easy to grok. So I don't know if this will answer your question, but I think it's in some ways important, So, okay. So we had this little industrial computer. So it was basically a chassis that had 4 expansion cards in it. And actually, I think one of the things that was really brilliant about Dan was that I don't think that many people made the connection around at that time. It was we were buying all this shit that was from the security world. It was it wasn't stuff that you were supposed to be using. And it was used for scientific purposes or, like I said, security. So it was, this thing, it was this big. It had 4 slots in it. In each slot, we put an expansion card in it. And each expansion card, plugged in, had a phone plug. And, we actually had to build our own audio preamps. I remember that. And I remember learning how to build audio preamps. But my point was, this thing had no screen. It had no keyboard. And for me, and again, I think this is probably the most important thing I learned from Dan. I don't want to insult him if he hears that, but I think it's important. Was basically what you kind of learned was that this thing had a serial cable, and as long as you plugged the right cable in and plugged it into your computer, and you ran like the terminal program, which isn't the same as the terminal program on the Mac now, because the terminal program on the Mac now speaks to the internet, but the terminal program back in the day could talk to a serial port. And the whole thing was like, you sent letters, you sent like literally a letter, and the thing treated the letter as a command, and it did something. And the same thing happened when the phone rang, it spat a letter back at you. Like, that was the whole fucking thing. And so like, once you could understand, and again, and I say this like actually with true gratitude to Dan, because this stuff was all like completely alien world, but you always have to realize in life again and again that like, we're all just like the same idiots struggling with the same problem. So then you realize like you just had to have the right cable and the right thing. And once you did that, it actually wasn't that hard. Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it does apply well to like that little, it wasn't the Blue Earth Micro. The Blue Earth Micro was something else, but whatever that like microcontroller chassis unit that we had that we used to control the phones, that was certainly what it applied to. But we also had technical glitches all the time. We definitely would code right until the show would go on the air. It definitely was almost always a mistake. And like the actual, like the crazy thing about YORB was that it was like 8 things talking to each other. And like, of course, in hindsight, the fact that it actually worked at all is astonishing. But it actually did usually work. Like, it's like, if the echo thing didn't work sometimes, which happened, like, it's like, whatever. So the echo thing's not working, this show. So if an individual thing could fail, and I guess another thing that's probably relevant to kind of, resilient systems, we had the systems that were always on, and then we had the systems that were on for the show. So the systems that were always on was like the bulletin board and the fax. And we had a phone. You could call in too and leave messages. So all those things was they, like, let's say you left a message, it recorded it to an audio file, and then it automatically would, like using effing AppleScript or something like that, would transfer that file over the network to the machine that the show used. So those systems didn't have to be on all the time. Like, they could completely die as long, and literally, like the literal representation of YORB on the computer that showed the 2D graphics, it was literally folders, and every model had a folder with the same name as the model, and you just knew that the files, were in there. So there was a certain sense of resilience with YORB in that it could work without everything working. The things that we couldn't, if the phones died, we were screwed.
And did that happen? Did you have events that things just went totally wrong?
It definitely happened, but not a lot. I'm sure that there were times where we had to do like kind of manual control and do like a fake show because we had phone problems. But despite what I said before, I think we were pretty careful about the phones. We did have problems sometimes with NYU, especially early on. Again, Dan might remember more than me, but if not NYU, I'm sorry, I'm at the med school. If the med school SGI would not talk to us, then we had no 3D, and that was a big problem for us. And again, I don't remember the specifics, but I remember early on, and I also bet that was a lot of the stuff that Niway worked on. I remember early on we had a really hard time getting that stuff to be stable. I mean, it's just even like at the 500 to 1,000 polygons a second we were doing, it was very challenging.
I guess as we're thinking about how we're building out this new version of YORB under very different contexts than you had, which is to say, YORB 2020 is mainly a response to us all being in quarantine, to the fact that the ITP floor is no longer accessible to any of us or the current students of ITP, and so we've built it to allow students to spend time with one another, to allow the ITP spring show to happen in this space, and that sort of hopefully kind of spontaneous interactions that you'd normally have on the floor. I guess thinking about YORB, the YORB that you worked on, and the current YORB, and you know, whichever YORB exists in your mind, like what is YORB?
On some level, I think the theme parallel is true. Like ultimately, if I kind of want to restate what I said earlier in light of what you just said, YORB wasn't a literal representation of a physical space. Nonetheless, it was a space where people could get together for unexpected synchronous interactions. And yes, what I said earlier was that many of those people knew each other already because they would coordinate. And to me, like, actually, that was really the most special part of it. I always thought that was pretty cool that people made a plan. I couldn't believe people actually made a plan. But to an extent, we also had people who, didn't make a plan, or, were not like, preordained, who just kind of like wanted to be in that space. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like, it sounds like there's a parallel and there's divergence, but I think that the parallel sounds very strong. I think that what probably YORB kind of lacked in, I don't want to say we lacked in production values. I actually think that the low production values were an advantage for us, but we always had surprises. So that was like, I think that was kind of key. And when I say the low production values worked for us, it's like the suspension of disbelief was almost easier because it already looked so ridiculous. And it was already only moving at like 4 frames a second. So I think it kind of like, you didn't really, I didn't. It's hard for me to I can kind of extrapolate how I thought people reacted to it. But I actually always thought kind of the junkier we looked, like the better it actually worked. But it's a different time. So it's hard to say, but I nonetheless, I think that there's an aspect, like there's an aspect of control and agency, along with spontaneity and fun that are kind of in the mix there, that it sounds like you're also trying to do, which I think is neat. I think probably the biggest difference between what I'm, seeing now and what, YORB was, and I'm not saying this was a good thing about YORB, but I still think it's important, was in YORB, only one person was in control. Somebody was always in control. Like here, nobody's in control. Like if I want, I'm out, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a huge, but that's, the entire world of media has changed in the interim, where like, media at that time was all shared experience.
Yeah.
Media now is all like asynchronous personal experience. So what I think is kind of interesting about the space, I think there's a lot of people that have come through ITP kind of like, dreaming about reconstituting the shared experience of everybody watching the same thing at the same time. And I think it's like a super hard thing to pin down, but I still think there's something there. I don't know what it is, but I think there's something there. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, no, that definitely
I don't think I actually answered your question at all.
No, that definitely answers part of it. I think, I mean, we're very much inspired, I think, by the spirit of YORB as we see it 30 years later, or 20 something years later, which is to say, I think this current version bears little like direct resemblance to YORB, but I think what we're trying to achieve is I hope somewhat related, in that it allows people to interact with one another and with the like media around them.
I think that YORB also, like, it took on a lot of the qualities of Dan, and like I have to say, like, to Dan's great credit, like he just doesn't take it that seriously, and I don't mean by that he didn't like work on it. Like, it was just like, it was never that heavy. It was never pretentious. It was like, it was always a total goof. Like, it was always like this dude, like fucking like dropping a bullhorn out the window above Green Street. And you were just like, oh, and then to answer your question, like when you asked the question about interacting with people, we did have a time when we had the camera out the window where people would start coming. Like people would like literally start like showing up like at ITP. And that's like, I mean, that was like cute, but then it was like not cute. So, but yeah, it's funny. It just reminded me of that. So I think, yeah, I think the thing about YORB was that it was just always really silly. It was never, it had no pretensions. It had really no pretensions to anything, which I think was probably its greatest strength.
So we actually did a quick internet search of you, and among other things, we found there's a lot out there, as there is for the rest of us. And I just wanted to mention a couple projects that seemed exciting. One was an early online exhibit. One was involvement in the alpha release of processing. One was hosting a radio show at Berkeley. And another was a 3-part blog post about the best winter gloves, and also maybe some beekeeping equipment that you made.
Listen, it's been a long and winding road.
Yeah.
And yes.
Is there a thread of logic here? Is there like a thing that drives you through all this? Not to put you on.
No. Actually, I was going to say, it was only a one-time show, but we also did kind of a spin-off from YORB called LoveNet. That was like a dating. That was a dating show that kind of was more like, tried to look like a more conventional TV set, but also used avatars and dial-in and stuff like that. I don't know. I just kind of do what seems interesting. So bees are really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I moved to Sweden for a while, and I bike. And when you bike and you live in Sweden, actually having good gloves is super duper important. So I don't know. I mean, I feel a little stalked right now, so I'm a little bit like, whoa, what the fuck? But I at the same time, I mean, you're no different than anybody else in that regard. But again, like I think try to be curious, try to do. I don't know. I mean, probably it's the same facet as figuring out those microcontrollers. I don't know. I see something I like to understand it. That hasn't really changed.
For sure. Can I ask as a one last question, what it is that you're excited about now? What kind of projects you're involved in?
I mean, my day job right now is working at Tumblr. And I'm probably like, I mean, Tumblr and Tumblr's parent company also are very interesting, but for a different reason. I mean, they're interesting until I put my foot in my mouth here. What's interesting is that it's a huge distributed company that has no offices. And it's fascinating. And again, relevant to COVID. It's fascinating to work with people all over the world where like you literally never actually meet them in person. So that's something that happens to be really interesting to me right now in life. I'm really excited for the summer. I am really excited that I think, you know what, I'll tell you what I'm excited about. I'm excited that I believe that enough people in this country are waking up to the management catastrophe that is Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And I'm hopeful that enough people, again, like regardless of what your actual individual politics are, I actually think this country, for all its political problems, has always been reasonably well managed. And I think, what's frustrating, I mean, listen, I don't know you guys' politics, but I feel like with a lot of pain, I feel like the wall is crumbling right now. And I think that's really important. And it makes me a little bit optimistic. So whatever I'm doing, whatever bullshit I'm doing is fine. That's what I'm really looking forward to right now.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for being here.
No problem.
I guess the last thing is, at some point, once this quarantine starts to feel less, once it's less, when we're not in quarantine anymore, it would be great.
I'm going to get a haircut. Yeah. First, I'm going to get a haircut, and then I mean, I'm in the city pretty regularly. I was going to say, and if you guys have any follow-up questions, email, whatever, feel free to. Yeah, it's a little hard to kind of dig up the memories. It's been a really long time, but if anything comes up that you want to ask me about, don't hesitate to reach out.
For sure, and I'd love to get a hold. We heard you had some SysQuest 44 megabyte discs.
SyQuest. First thing, let's pronounce it right. I have done an excellent job, although maybe not. I've thought I had done an excellent job in my life periodically of completely destroying and burning my portfolio from time to time, so people like you couldn't dig it up. So I say I've not been totally successful. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I have entire bodies of work that I have completely chucked because they're on old computers. But I also do have a box of SyQuest discs. Many of them are from YORB, or at least from YORB era, that I've been schlepping around for 20 years. And I literally have I don't even know how many are left at this point. I probably have to check because sometimes you lose track of these things and they disappear. But if someone could clue me as to how to get,
I have no idea how to read them.
Yeah,
but I'd imagine it's possible. Anyway, enjoy your time outside, and thanks so much again for joining.
Best of luck. I hope your project goes well. Don't pay too much attention to what we did. Just do your own thing.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Right. Catch you guys later.
Thank you.
Bodies in the sand, tropical drink melting in your hand. We'll be falling in love to the rhythm of a steel drum band. Down in
YORB 2.0.
Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take you through Bermuda, Bahama. Come on, pretty mama, Key Largo, Montego, baby, why don't we go?
YORB 2.0. YORB 2.0.